Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the United Nations changed from the League of Nations to the United Nations, they had one responsibility: to protect that of the international community. And when the international community is being harmed, they have a responsibility to intervene. And what we would see on side proposition today is that the veto that is in place currently in the Security Council interferes in the way of this, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, I'm Prime Minister for side proposition today, and we're proposing the motion: this House believes that no nations in the UN Security Council should have the right to veto, and we on side proposition firmly propose on the basis that we must protect the international citizens of the international community. So before we get into our half of things on the House today, we'd like to establish a few terms in the resolution. Of course, this House would be none other than the United Nations. The Security Council would be the 5 permanent members that have the veto power that we are talking about here today. That of US, that of Russia, China, UK, and France. Those who have the power to veto these motions that are put before them in the Security Council. And when we would remove the right to veto, essentially, motions would be passed on a majority vote of the nations that are composing the Security Council. So the way things run when a motion is not vetoed, no, not at this time. So we would say that there's a definite need for this to take place, Mr. Speaker, on the basis that we must stop injustice, and we deem injustice to be evident when the majority sees it to be so. And we would say that when the majority of the Security Council says that there is an injustice worth fighting for, then the United Nations has a responsibility to take action on this motion. So we would say that the Security Council is able to deem this. And we would look to an example in Syria, for example, when they did not have the suitable amount of backup and people supporting them from the international community, and they've had this conflict going on for so long only because Russia and China have vetoed motions put before them that could actively intervene in this conflict. We would see that we have a responsibility to intervene today, and that is what we are proposing on side proposition. And we really come forward to you today with 2 burdens to prove. We say that first, it is the UN's responsibility to stop injustice when the majority of the Security Council deems it to be so, and the right of the veto prevents this from happening. And also, our second burden is that having a more involved United Nations Security Council would benefit the international community. We see that side opposition, I'll take you in a moment, has 2 burdens to prove as well to you today, Mr. Speaker. That of the removal of the right to veto is harmful to the United Nations and the Security Council, and that of the removal of the right to veto is harmful to the international community on a whole. Yes.
Passing by majority, typically the UK, France, and the US all side together against China and Russia. How does your resolution actually make things equal, assuming that the US, France, and UK will just pass resolutions?
We would say that there are other nations that compose the Security Council other than just the Big 5. We would say that there are other nations that are cycled in at 2-year intervals. We would say that these nations also have a big voice, and we want to give these nations a big voice in the Security Council, and their voices are not being heard when that of one of the Big 5 is able to silence them all on a motion that they deem is of the utmost importance for the international community. We would say that this would involve them greatly, so no, not at this time. We would say that we're proving our 2 major burdens to you today, Mr. Speaker, through 3 contentions: that of the responsibility of the United Nations to intervene in international conflict, that of the gridlock that the right to veto proposes in our society today. My partner Baybod will come forward to you in that this proposes a deterrent to stop perpetrators of these crimes against humanity, to really recognize what the UN Security Council is capable of providing justice to the community. So I'd like to get into the constructed case at this time. First off, with the responsibility of the United Nations Security Council. So what is the responsibility of the UN Security Council, Mr. Speaker? We would say it's to intervene in major conflict in the international community and to protect the innocent citizens of the international community, and they have a responsibility to this. We would say that in Syria, that many innocent citizens are harmed at the hands of their government, who is willing to harm them, and they are not getting due reinforcement and support. We would say that these people, that we have an obligation to these people to help them in the UN Security Council today, no, not at this time. We would say that, we would ask the question also, is that the case right now? Is the UN Security Council currently doing this? We would say that at times, but not enough. We would say that Syria has not received due support or intervention by the international community. We would say that Libya also didn't receive this attention and support soon enough. We would say that it took way too long for the international community to get involved. We had an obligation to get involved sooner when we knew the issue was prominent. No, not at this time. We would say that the veto power has been used to stop justice from being served as soon as it has been recognized. So the next question to be asked is, how is veto power against the spirit of the United Nations and that of the Security Council? We would say that the UN has a role and a presence in the international community as a body that can enforce justice. When the citizens cannot stand up for themselves against the armies and against the tyrannous governments that commit crimes against them, we would say that the UN has this ability and has this report to be able to stand up and defend the rights of these people. We would also say that it is not the case when the veto power is used to stop them from taking action. We would say that the UN Security Council's presence and their ability to defend these people is directly intervened by when just one of these big 5 nations is able to say this cause is not important enough to be stood up for, even when the majority of the Security Council nations say that it is. Would you not agree?
Wouldn't you say it can be inherently harmful to a resolution itself if one of those countries on the big 5 isn't able to veto it but disagrees with the resolution so inherently?
Well, we would say that it is not just the big 5 that's opinions matter. We would say that if they had the right to say no, and if they thought that their stance was logical, then they would be able to persuade a majority of the members in the Security Council to agree with them. We would say that the big 5 is not the only people who have a say, yet that is the case right now. We want to change that with this motion today, no, not at this time. We would say that the UN has an opportunity to remove this buffer on justice to fully respect its role as a protector of the innocent citizens of the international community. And I think that I've really established this point of responsibility quite clearly inside Proposition's case. So with that, I'd like to now get on to the second contention of First Side government today, which is that of the gridlock that the veto power imposes today. We would ask, what is the veto power? When essentially what happens is the Security Council meets with very pressing issues. Should we intervene in Syria? Should we oppose economic sanctions on X nation? We see that when the issues that are pressed upon them are so important, that they have a responsibility to act immediately. We would say that the veto power stops them from acting when they are aware and when they are able and when they have deemed that it is a good motion to act upon.
Sir.
Would you not agree?
Okay, what would you do if the UN was to make a hasty decision to eliminate the right of Israel to exist and the US was to start a world war over it?
We would say that this is, the side opposition really does underestimate the knowledge, the capacity, and the credentials of the Security Council on a whole. We would say that all the nations involved are able to make conscious decisions. They aren't going to make these hasty, rash decisions that they would say that the UN Security Council is suddenly just going to jump to. These aren't stupid people, Mr. Speaker. These are representatives, highly trained, highly qualified, conscious professionals, Mr. Speaker, that know what they're talking about, that know the issues, and that are able to make a concise decision as a majority. We would say that the Security Council's veto power currently gets in this gridlock that I'm talking about in this contention. We would say that since the Security Council doesn't meet daily, they meet over long intervals, it takes a long time to change the minds of those who have vetoed important motions. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, we see in order to get the support of the vetoing party, the motion must be compromised in some way. Instead of, and there are two real problems with compromising the motion at hand. We would say that the effectiveness of the compromise resolution is a factor here, and the time taken to enact it. The effectiveness, if we propose a original resolution to intervene in Syria, and this was compromised to sending food aid in Syria, we would say that this is not the issue that was needed to be addressed. However, we would say that if it took, even if it was the direct issue, if it took 6 months, a year, 2 years to enact, that's far too long. The issue is not being dealt with, and overall, the time taken to enact the right issue is not being dealt with on a whole. We would say this gridlock is a direct harm to the citizens of the international community. The UN Security Council has a right to intervene, and for these reasons, that responsibility in gridlock, we beg strongly to propose. Thank you.
Excellent. We now call for the first speaker of the opposition to deliver a substantive and rebuttal.
We think the world that side proposition has talked about today, where they want equality and hasty decision-making, is kind of a nice one. But unfortunately, side proposition has completely ignored reality. The fact that in international relations, there is inherently a weighted balance of power. The fact that in order for the UN to be effective, there are certain countries that need to buy into it, and certain countries that we need to respect in order for any sort of resolution to actually be effective. That's the stance we take on our side of the House today. And in fact, to greater align the Security Council with the sort of benefits we see it garners, we actually are going to propose a countermodel today. Our countermodel today would support the shuffling of membership on the potential shuffling of membership on the Security Council with a review every 10 years. So what would happen is we'd still maintain 5 members on the council, and we think that countries would nominate themselves, and new countries and old countries would nominate themselves. They would be evaluated by the General Assembly on criteria such as monetary and troop commitment, presence on the international stage, economic and military might, marginally on the humanitarian record, and things like population, and then the General Assembly would vote on which countries they would like to see form the top 5. We think this is beneficial because it causes countries to be on the top 5 who have a network of countries that support them, who meet all these criteria and are actually the most powerful. It maintains the Security Council as current to these times. And we're going to support why this is so beneficial in my argumentation today. But first, I'd like to see what came out of the first speaker on their side of the House today. So the first thing he talked about was this model where they're automatically going to take away the veto power from the 5 permanent members on the Security Council. We ask how this is going to happen, how these members are actually going to be willing to give up their veto power, and what occurs when they do, the fact that they might disengage. We think that there needs to be a reason for them to buy in. Our model is actually beneficial because it legitimizes the power that these countries have in the UN. It takes away all sorts of things that people say oh, the P5 are outdated. We actually think that that's a sort of buy-in because we expect that countries like China and the USA will always get voted back in because they're so large and they actually have such a huge support base, but actually it legitimizes their view. We don't see this sort of mechanism on their side of the House today. We think their side causes these countries to disengage. The first thing they talked about was this idea that countries have a responsibility to intervene, and they gave the example of Syria, where intervention didn't occur and sanctions weren't put in place because Russia vetoed the resolution. We think that this happened for a very good reason, because if sanctions were passed on Syria, we don't think Russia has any mechanism that forces them to conform to the resolution. They're such a powerful nation, they can do whatever they want, which we think is a problem because they're one of Syria's biggest trading partners. They provide them with all their weapons. We actually don't think that resolution would in any way have been effective. What actually occurred forced them to come back to the drawing table to actually negotiate a resolution that could be effective, and it also maintained the legitimacy of the UN. It didn't make it look like they passed resolutions that they couldn't put into play. We think that their logic is simply faulty today, and they actually gave a great example in Libya of a country where, potentially it took a while to make the decision to bomb Libya or to take Gaddafi out of power, but in fact it was very successful because it wasn't a hasty decision. Then they talked about the spirit of intervention. Again, we think that you have to bring in the big powers in order for intervention to be effective, and I'm going to discuss that in my point. Then they talked about gridlock. Again, we'd say that hasty decisions are problematic. I'll get back to that in my argumentation. They couldn't respond to our POI about the potential for Israel's destruction and a world war over that. That's going to be in my constructive as well. We think that the US has used many of their votes to support votes which would condemn Israel, and actually we don't think that the Security Council nations are as rational as they would say today. So what are my points today? First, thank you, I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of the UN, then about the idea of caution. My partner is going to talk about mechanisms in place. So let's talk about the effectiveness of the UN. We recognize, I'll take you in a moment, that in the world today there's a balance of power, and it's ludicrous to assume that in an IR body every single nation is actually equal. It's a weighted deal. Sure.
Wouldn't you agree that every single year and every single 2 years we already decide on what new 10 nations go into the Security Council? So all you are actually changing is who are the 5 nations that have the power to veto. Whereas you have a common misconception that there are only 5 members on the Security Council, as you've brought up throughout this debate.
That's not our assumption. We actually think it's problematic that their model will give so much power to countries on the Security Council like the Maldives, to tiny powers that we don't actually think are have as much strength in economic policy, and we don't actually need to engage. We think it's great to give them a say in the Security Council, but it's ultimately the big powers that make the decisions and should have the strongest say. And I'll get to why that is in my point. So we say that we need the P5 to stay engaged. The UNSC tries to do tangible things like invade countries, like put sanctions on them. It's not like other bodies in the UN that are more theoretical. Therefore, we think that they require the biggest players in terms of influence, commitment, might, and economic wealth to contribute. It's simply impossible to actually do anything if you don't have any money. If the US is disengaged and they don't give their billions of dollars a year to the UN, we think that those are very important things. So essentially, when these powers disengage, the UNSC becomes an empty organ like the League of Nations was, which we saw them bring up in their speech. We think the nature of international relations is there is no way to force countries to conform to resolutions. The best way to do it is to make sure that the biggest powers actually maintain their engagement, that we listen to them, and therefore that they can use their influence to force resolutions on the powers below them. We actually think that that's what makes the UN effective, the fact that we have troop contributions from powers like the UN, like the US, from powers like Britain. And we think that that's very beneficial. We think that the US could easily back out of the UN. They could lose us billions of dollars in terms of UN funding, but they don't do this because their actual power on the Security Council maintains their engagement. So why would the P5 become disengaged under their model today? Well, we think that the veto power gives them a means of keeping their interests at heart. It makes the UN allows in the UN a mechanism for maintaining the interests of the most powerful nations so that they have a reason for staying there. We also think it provides a representation for their power. It gives them the due influence that they deserve on the UN because they have bigger populations and more power. And we think that if we take it away from the biggest nations, that if China or the USA was to lose their veto power, we don't think they'd be particularly happy. We think they'd withdraw their support. That would be quite harmful. We also would look at effectiveness. We don't think that, as I gave as an example, you can sanction Syria when Russia is just going to go through with it anyway. Big powers don't have to follow through. Therefore, we think a resolution that doesn't actually take into account their interests, that is something they won't conform to, is pretty useless and actually in many ways harmful because it degrades the legitimacy of the UN, the belief that their resolutions actually hold weight. We think that their resolution encourages countries to come back to the table, to have more discussion. This is a beneficial thing because it makes more effective resolutions, unlike what they say. Very quickly, caution. We think that part of the UN's job is to prevent conflict, not to enter into more dangerous and hasty situations. The veto power actually does this in two ways. First of all, we think it was established because military powers, if they don't agree with a resolution, have the potential to create a world war over it. We'd give the example of Israel again. We'd say that if a resolution was passed that condemned Israel and caused there to be an invasion of Israel, the US would be more than willing to go to war for them. It would be more than possible that there would be a world war over it, which is why we don't think we want to pass a resolution, even though the majority of the Security Council might support it, that does such a thing. We think there needs to be a sober second thought. Another example we'd give is the Korean War, where Russia was actually not there when they had the vote on it, when they would have vetoed it, and therefore they supported North Korea in that war and made it a greater conflict, a more harmful conflict. Sober second thought is good, not hasty decision making. That's what the veto maintains, and that's why we think that their side ultimately falls today. Thank you very much.
We'd like to remind everyone to try to keep their phones on silent, and we would call for the Senate Speaker of the government to deliver his substantive rebuttal and refutation.
People are still dying in Syria. People died in Libya. But what we've met today is a side opposition that has given us a model today that essentially does nothing and changes nothing and keeps the exact same problem we've been having for years on end. And this is the exact grounds why we oppose the counter model today. But before I actually get into that, I'd get into my own constructive case. I'd like to take a look at what side opposition today has given us so far. And really the first thing we take exception to is the rebuttal to my partner's points. My partner gave you the point of responsibility. He said that it's the responsibility of the United Nations to protect the weak against armed governments and corrupt ones. But what they told you was that Syria, that essentially the only thing they really told you today is that Russia was not, that this would be completely ineffectual and our model would be completely ineffectual in actually solving this problem. Well, why? Well, they said that, well, there's no mechanism to force Russia to actually get in there and attack or commit sanctions against Syria, commit sanctions against any sort of nation that indeed is hurting its own people. But we would say to that is that the only reason that the United Nations as a whole did not intervene in Syria was because the majority did not vote, or because rather, Russia and China vetoed against action. We say that our model today takes out this right to veto and actually gives them the validity,
Sir.
and it gives them the ability to actually walk in and end the problem. And we say we'd like to hear some sort of substantial rebuttal to this from side opposition, but not from POI. Okay. The second point my partner gave you was about the gridlock that having the veto creates. He told you it's that the right to veto prevents the UN from actually making an active decision. No, thank you. And the real rebuttal we heard from side opposition is that not having the right to veto would essentially create very hasty decisions that aren't founded. They brought up Israel and they said, oh, they'd create a world war. What we say to that is that delegates that go to the United Nations are not stupid, ladies and gentlemen. We said delegates that go to the United Nations understand that, yeah, if they walk into Israel, start shooting up the place, and do it without any sort of founding, yes, indeed, yes, there might be a world war. But the fact of the matter is, they're not dumb, and they're going to know there's a world war, so no one's going to make any hasty decisions to go to war. War is a very big decision. No one's going to make it for kicks, ladies and gentlemen.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Okay, so let's take a look. I'd like to take a look at the arguments first, but first, let's take a look at their model, which is the major thing we take exception to. They said that what they would essentially introduce is the shuffling of various countries in and out of the UN Security Council. But when we say that, the fact of the matter is they're not really proposing a solution, ladies and gentlemen. What they essentially said, verbatim, was that countries would vote on who they want in the United Nations Security Council. And then they went on to say that the fact of the matter was that they were going to vote the same people in anyway. Well, yes, ladies and gentlemen, we said this is the exact problem we have in the system today. And beyond this, they kept the right to veto. No, thank you. So we see the exact same effectual problems that we've been outlining to you throughout our proposition case today. We said that their model today proposes no solution. It proposes no legitimate solution to all the problems we've been outlining to you. It proposes no solution to Syria. It proposes no solution to what happened in Libya. And it proposes no solution to any other instance in which the nations of the world are reluctant, or two nations veto going in and stopping a sort of injustice. No, thank you. Now, I'd like to take a look at their arguments today. They said they gave us two, but essentially they only gave us one. And that was of hasty decisions. They said that, as I already butted, countries are simply going to quickly attack other countries for fun because that's what they do in the United Nations. But what we say to that, ladies and gentlemen, is that the delegates, once more, are not dumb. What we would say is that, yes, they're intelligent, educated people. That's how they got to where they are today. So they're simply not going to propose a war every time they're dissatisfied with another nation, ladies and gentlemen. We said that, no, thank you. We said that beyond this, they talked about, again, might as well bring this up again, Israel, and how they would start a world war against Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that, again, they are not stupid. They're not going to go start a world war against Israel because they know that there would be a full-scale international conflict. We said that the only no, thank you, I'll take you in a minute, actually. We'd say that the only reason they would ever start a world war against Israel is if they legitimately thought there was a major problem with Israel, and that Israel was taking a major action against the rest of the world, and there was a pressing need. They're not going to just do it for fun, and they're not just going to do it because they felt like it.
Okay, the reason we use Israel as an example is because the U.S. has used their veto multiple times to actually take down a resolution that would otherwise ruin Israel.
Oh, no, thank you. Okay, for one, we heard no really specification as to what are we talking about ruining Israel. Are we talking about military action here? Are we taking sanctions? In order for me to properly respond to this sort of POI, well, I need to know what kind of action is being taken and what kind of action the United States has actually vetoed. We're not saying committing economic sanctions on Israel would start a world war, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. So let's take a look at my constructive case today. And really the main point in this is that of the deterrence. And I'm really going to be proving that having a more involved United Nations benefits the international community as a whole. Okay, so once more, let's take a look at Libya. Why did Gaddafi stay in power for so long, and why did he kill people for so long? Let's take a look at Syria. Why did Assad even start killing people, and why is he still in power and still killing people? We say that because they didn't think they'd be punished. We said that they still continue to do this, and they start to do this because they don't think there's a consequence for the actions, ladies and gentlemen. We said that criminals start, no thank you. We said that criminals start to do crimes because they think they're going to get away with it. So what we really need to do today is we need to show people like Assad, people like Gaddafi, that there is a solution to this. I'm going to get that there is a consequence to their actions. No, thank you. I'm going to get into what the consequence actually is later on in my speech. I would say that the fact that people like Assad and people like Gaddafi stay in power for so long and actually start killing people is a testament to the inaction of the United Nations. We see that because Russia, countries like Russia and countries like China, no thank you, continue to veto resolutions to sanction or just straight up use military force in countries who are hurting their people, it's because nothing is getting done, and they know nothing is getting done. So that beyond this, what we're doing with it is that it essentially shows them that the world itself is extremely reluctant to punish them for their crimes and punish them for their actions. I mean, they essentially think that they're going to get away with it, so they're going to do it anyway. There's no punishment for your offense. We say that when they see that there's no punishment for their offense, no thank you, they're more likely to commit it. And that is the exact problem with the United Nations right now. Okay, so how does taking away the right to veto actively fix this issue? We say that in most cases, no thank you. In most cases, action would be done because the majority of the time, the majority actually wishes to do some sort of action and actually wishes to intervene, either with sanctions or with military action. But we see that the only reason they didn't do so was because someone like Russia or because someone like China essentially vetoed it. By taking away, no thank you, by taking away the right to veto, the majority will oftentimes vote to intervene, which creates a more involved United Nations. What you essentially do with having a more involved United Nation is that you show people like Assad and you show people like Gaddafi that there is in fact a consequence to their actions, that there is in fact a punishment for their actions. We see that following the same logic I presented to you, criminals do crimes when they think they're going to get away with it. But when you have a more involved United Nations that sets a punishment for their actions, well, they're less likely to commit those very same crimes because they know they're not going to get away with it, ladies and gentlemen. They're not going to be able to simply do it and not have to worry about the consequences. You essentially set a deterrent for people like Assad and people like Gaddafi to not start shooting. Because the fact of the matter is they're going to be punished and there is a consequence for their actions that the United Nations itself is going to impose on them. So really what have I proven to you today? Or what have we all proven to you today? On one end, we proved it to you that it's the responsibility of the United Nations to actively intervene in the world when they see that there is an act of injustice being done, and that having the right to veto essentially harms this injustice, and having the right to veto doesn't let them fulfill the responsibility. But the second thing we proved to you is that having a more involved United Nations as a whole is really going to benefit the international community as a whole because it sets a deterrent and it stops people from shooting their civilians before it actually happens. Thank you.
Now, once again, please, honorable audience, please turn your mobiles on silent. Thank you very much. We now call for the second speaker from opposition to deliver her substantive rebuttal and refutation.
We've seen a side proposition today that is fairly idealistic. We've seen a side proposition that doesn't fully understand why a veto is in place and why that veto actually allows our world and allows the United Nations to maintain peace in society, to help resolutions be not only passed but actually be effective, be able to supply the troops, to supply the monetary necessities that come along with resolutions, and supply the need and the support for those resolutions. So what I'm going to be speaking to you about today is the existing mechanisms we have in the United Nations for like keeping the United Nations international, and like how our model that we propose today is actually going to improve the United Nations as a whole. But before I get into that, I'm going to go into and rebut exactly everything that they have essentially said on side proposition today. So this first argument they came up with was responsibility, and that like we need to intervene in major conflicts. And we think that on side opposition that happens, like we can intervene in major conflicts when it is necessary. We don't think this resolution changes that. What we do see is that first off, with we think that with passing this resolution, we're going to have a lot of like hasty decisions made. Like we think having a veto serves a very strong purpose. We think that it forces countries to come to like a better consensus to actually ensure that the resolution works to a better extent. We see that like countries that have the most clout, countries that have like the resources that they're going to be able like to provide for these resolutions that are going through, we actually think that those are the countries that we need the backing from. We think there's a reason that those countries have the support that they do. So this next idea is that like people aren't getting the necessary support, and what we see is that like necessary, you know, kind of like deemed by who. We don't always think that like the support that they claim is necessarily like, we don't see like who it's being deemed by. This next idea that like the second response to this, like we don't actually think that like military support is always a good thing. We think that like when you support a country, there's like a variety of things that you need to go through before that support is just like unconditionally given. We think that like you need to have countries come to sort of like consensus in these issues. So like this next idea that they came up with today and talked to us about was gridlock, and that like we need to intervene on pressing issues. And we've already refuted this fairly, I'll take you in a moment, we already refuted this quite a bit in our first speech, or in our first speech. This idea that like we actually think that taking your time to make decisions and like is actually really necessary. And further that, like you need the support of the big powers in order to make these decisions and resolutions actually useful. And I'm going to get into further about that further on, but before that, I'll take this that
with your model that you're proposing that the 5 veto powers would get elected by the General Assembly, by the Security Council, because you didn't specify, that if the direction of your case is going, that we need the big 5, that we need those 5 countries to be having all the power, to be getting the support to the UN, that because those 5 countries may not be the countries that get the veto power underneath this election, that really your whole case falls.
Okay, no, we don't actually see this at all. We think that like the countries that are going to be able, because we laid out like a very specific criteria in our first speech, the countries that are able to get this like actual power and to be like elected into the Security Council are countries that are going to have clout. They're countries that are going to have resources that they're able to provide. Further this, we heard in your second speech that the same countries would essentially be re-elected into the Security Council. So we think that like that proves, A, that disproves your POI, and 2, that proves that actually the recognize like the rest of the General Assembly recognizes a necessity and recognizes like a reason why these countries are put as and given a veto power in the Security Council. So like let's look at this next idea that they came up with. They said that like a motion is going to be compromised by those who have a veto power. But we actually think that in order for a motion to be effective, in order for a resolution to go through and actually like have clout and be upheld, we think that it needs the support of these big 5 countries. But further to this, they talked about like this idea later on in their speech, they talked about this idea later on in their speech about like legitimacy. We think that like if resolutions aren't working because they simply don't have the backing, because we don't think countries like Maldives, for example, in the Security Council has like the resources that to go for these resolutions, like provide for these resolutions. We think that like when these resources aren't provided and these resolutions become ineffective, we think that that makes the UN like seem like an illegitimate body. We think that like that's not helping any like or giving like a sort of like legitimacy to the UN when the resolutions are not working in the first place. So then they came up with this idea that like the only reason that Syria didn't pass was because of of Russia and China. But what we see is that like the reason why we think that like first off, if it did pass by a majority as they're proposing, we don't think it would end the problem. We actually think that we would see like massive retaliation from Russia and China in this stance because they're such supporters of Syria. So we see that like would almost create a war between the two. And second is we see that like they don't actually, like we need the support of all the other nations that I've already gone into. So finally, let's get into this idea of deterrence that they talked about. We see that like so first off, they never refuted this idea of Korea, and that like our example of Korea, and that the larger the conflict, like the conflict became larger because of Russia. And this idea that they came up with in deterrence, that like we need like actions would be done, and like they would rather just intervene, and we wouldn't see this type of deterrence. What we actually say on side opposition is that like we think that that would assume that like the resolution would work. We think that when you have the countries that aren't able to give you the backing, we don't think that the resolutions would work, and we think that like that undermines their entire deterrence point, because when you have resolutions that aren't working, we don't think that acts as a deterrent. In fact, that just portrays the United Nations in an incredibly illegitimate light. Yes?
I'm quite curious here, side opposition. Why are there other members on the Security Council besides the Big Five if their opinions are nothing but contradictory to the Big Five and they don't help at all?
No, we think that there's like value to everyone else's opinion in this in the Security Council. We don't see there's a reason we have other members, but we see as the necessity for the countries that are elected into the Big Five to actually be able to those are the countries that are going to be supporting these resolutions on majority in their resources. We think that's the reason why they're there. So let's get into this point of existing mechanisms. So we see that the United Nations is an incredibly international body. We see that there's all countries are represented. We see that we have methods of election. Further, we see that there's opportunities for countries to apply and get elected into certain councils. We think that all of these things are incredibly beneficial. We don't think it's this unfair society or unfair thing that the side proposition would like to propose. Further, we see this idea that vetoes aren't always used. We think that even though, we think that a country actually has an option to also say no. We see numerous times, China, for example, may not disagree with the resolution, but we don't see them actually veto it. We see them simply say no to the resolution. We think that that's an alternative and another option. We think that, we don't see the veto always being, abused, as side proposition would like to have you believe. And further that, we saw a contradiction in this when they saw, the same countries are going to be reelected. We don't think that there's, this inherent, harm that exists in the veto power right now. Further this, we see that, some countries already have, disproportionate amounts of power. We think that in order for a UN to work, we have countries with different amounts of power in them. We see, for example, countries with a very small population having the exact same vote as a country that has a massive population. We see a country like China, for example, versus a much smaller nation. We think that there's discrepancies in the UN that exist, and we think that the veto power is one way to give those countries that have the mass amounts more people, the mass amounts of more international relevance, more international clout, more international power. We think that there's a reason why we give those countries this sort of power. So finally, we look at this idea of an incentive for countries to actually respect the United Nations. We think that under our model today, we're actually improving the encouragement and improving countries to be more involved and more active within the United Nations. We think that it encourages countries to create new ties with other countries, because you think that in order for you to be elected now onto the Security Council and remain and have your veto, we think that you need to create international ties. We think that you need to create ties and work with other countries. We think that that's incredibly beneficial. Further, we see that that would help improve the amount of troops and funds that they put into these, or that they put under resolutions, because that would help in their elections into the Security Council to have a veto power. And we see that it could even help improve certain countries human rights records, because we set out a very strict criteria on exactly how this would work. So what have we talked to you about today? We've shown you the effectiveness of the UN. We've shown you that the cautionary principles that will keep peace this way. And we've shown you the existing mechanisms that exist in the UN. For all those reasons, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Ending the constructive speeches on side government, we call for the third speaker, Dean's opposition.
Five countries must always get their way. 5 countries can never have their voices revoked. Because these 5 countries, when the UN was created in 1946, were relevant. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen throughout the bench on side opposition by a new model being created was the continuation of the status quo. However, where they did decide to differ from the status quo, and what I'll be getting into in this whip speech, really, is that they decided to change who those big 5 are. Now, really, the general themes that this debate has come down to so far is the duty of the United Nations. When do we have the responsibility to go in somewhere and help what is going on? Gridlocks to the United Nations. What currently is the huge problem of the United Nations, and what is the ineffectiveness of the United Nations? And the value of a vote. Why do some countries get more of a value to vote than other countries? Why is it that some countries get more political clout than other countries? Now, but first of all, I would like to point out the major contradiction that side opposition made with their model. No, thank you. Now, what they came up to us and said was that with their model, what they said was that these big five countries, as well as the other 10 that are always reelected, will be reelected. But furthermore, what is changing here is that there will be another 5 that will get the power to veto by election. This was because this was in their model. Really, they are still keeping somewhat the value of veto. However, their first point is completely counterintuitive to this model. Because their first point of the disinterest of the big 5, what the disinterest of the big 5 talks about is how these five nations must always be in the Security Council, because otherwise they will not provide enough backing to the Security Council and to UN resolutions in order for them to be effective. So because these big 5 nations won't be in there underneath our model, these resolutions won't be effective. However, underneath their model, even though they came up and said, well, no, because they're big countries, they will get elected in, what we really see is that who knows what could happen. With these shifting times and more people against the United States and more people against Russia, we see that these 2 countries underneath their model could end up not being in the power to veto. And this has really come down to what the value of a vote is. For my theme of the value of a vote, is that really these votes are equal underneath our model. However, underneath their model, that we need to elect somebody to become a dictator in the United Nations. We need to elect somebody to become a dictator in the United Nations to determine, you know what, I think that I was elected to say this, so I can say that these people no longer get to have their way. However, and what we really see is that because the big 5 won't be interested underneath their own contention, because the big 5 won't be interested underneath our model and underneath their model, if the big 5 are not elected into this democratically, then they will not be able to give their backing. So when side opposition conceded this, really, they conceded the case. Yes.
Okay, so what our model does is it ensures the countries in power are always the most powerful ones. So potentially Bangladesh, who contributes the most troops to the UN, would be over a country like France. How is that a problem?
Thank you. Now what we really see is that the countries that are inside the Security Council right now, such as Togo, such as Morocco, such as Guatemala, are these 3 countries really major superpowers? Now with these 3 countries that were elected to the Security Council, underneath their model, who knows? They could be elected to become the veto powers as well. So because the countries like Togo, Morocco, and Guatemala could become the new U.S., Russia, and China. No, thank you. Because these 3 countries could end up becoming the new Russia and China underneath their own model and underneath their own point. They're contradicting themselves, saying that these 3 countries could end up being the ones who are powerful underneath their model. Now, I'd really like to move on to this whole idea. Now, I'd really like to move on to basically their second opinion, their second argument of their 3 supposed arguments, which was the sober second thought. Now, what really came up in this, and this was really for my gridlock theme. Now, underneath their sober second thought theme, they really came up and told us today that we need vetoes on the Security Council to come in and make sure that what is going on in the Security Council is the right thing to do. However, we see. No, thank you. Now, however, we see that the reason that we go out and elect a Security Council, that we send delegates to the United Nations, I'll take you in one moment, is to make sure that correct decisions are being made. Is that we trust the Security Council so much underneath both of our models that we entrust them to make the right decisions for us, and that we really trust them to make these decisions so much so that we give them an equal chance to vote underneath our model. So really, they don't need to be able to bring down an entire resolution when it's been well thought out. Yes.
So if I'm Russia and my veto power is taken away and a resolution passes that supports Syria, for example, what is my incentive to not then back Syria and then go to war with the United Nations?
Thank you.
Now
I can address this in 2 ways. First of all, how underneath your model this exact same thing could happen, because Russia may not have the right to veto underneath your model. So this exact problem that you were bringing up could happen. However, I would also like to bring up how underneath our model this won't happen. Now, the reason that this won't happen is because Russia, as you try to say, is very a stupid country. That is not the case. Russia knows the consequences of going to war. This is the same reason why during the Cold War, there was no World War III. The reason why nuclear bombs were not thrown across the Pacific Ocean was because they knew that this would be a total annihilation of the world. We know that conventional war tactics are not what is in use today, and so we know that because it would be a nuclear warfare and an obliteration of society, we know that no country would actually go through and do this, as side opposition is trying to misrepresent. Now, so really, now that we've proved that gridlocks would not actually happen, because what would actually really happen is that these countries would be able to make their rational thoughts and make them move quickly as well, and to make them both effective and efficient. I should really move on to my third theme of the duty of the UN. Now really what side opposition tried to come up here today was to talk about how we need the respect of the UN. How really countries are more involved because they have the power of veto. However, what we already see is that countries are already very involved. When we see that countries such as Bangladesh, as they brought up, that provide more soldiers than any to the UN peacekeeping force, because these countries who are not even on the Security Council, that they provide so many troops, we really see that their point of respect to the UN and sending more troops because these people may be elected on to have veto power really falls. Because what we already see in this world today is that nations that are not on the Security Council, who are not trying to get on the Security Council, such as Bangladesh, are already sending so many people to United Nations peacekeeping missions. However, furthermore, what we really saw was that unconditional support is not what exactly matters. Because we see that if we can get a majority of support to go in and help the responsibility of the UN and the duty of the United Nations to come in and protect citizens' rights when they are being harmed, we see that there is no justification to not protect a citizen when his life is in danger, especially from his own government. So when we see that this justification that they are trying to bring up, that really we need everybody to come in to agree on this one thing, because this really falls mainly because we see that these nations really do not have to all come together, because we know that one nation will not try to do a total annihilation of the world and of themselves, and because we see that with the majority vote, we will see that the majority of nations, the majority of troops that come in, will agree with this. So because it's the duty of the United Nations to not have vetoes, because without vetoes there would be less gridlocks, and because the value of vote is more apparent without a veto, this resolution must and will stand underneath our model. Thank you.
Ending the constructive speeches for preliminary rounds of Heart of Europe 2012, we call the second speaker, third speaker of Team Opposition.
It's interesting today that side proposition gave us a case that they told was going to give us faster decisions, and in some way invading more countries in a faster manner was going to lead to like the UN mandate that we will keep the peace and create equality and hear all people's voices in decision making. There were a lot of problems down the bench today on side proposition, namely because they didn't see our counter model coming, failed to adjust their case to that, and on that basis didn't engage with our material, both in terms of their constructive and in terms of their clash. I'm going to run through what they've told us today, both in terms of like the principled reason behind it and the actual effectiveness in our resolution. I'm going to give you a clear-cut reasoning behind the harms of their models and their like misguided refutation of the excellent counter model we proposed in terms of summing up the debate in terms of refutation. So first of all, they were very adamant that this idea is that to interfere to protect, like the duty of the UN is to interfere to protect the international community. That the duty of the UN is to intervene on countries' sovereign rights in order to protect people they deem are harmed. They think we have to like protect them from arms and dictatorship over the point of sovereignty. I was trying to ask approximately 25 times in a POI as to why, if this is legitimate, why haven't we invaded hated countries like Sudan, like Zimbabwe, like Uzbekistan already, when their leaders are so despotic towards their citizens? If that is truly the mandate of the UN today, why are we drafting resolutions in the Security Council that aren't fixing it, right? Like, we think because the only two examples they could provide us were of Syria and of Libya, because those were the only two ones that actually fit into their case today, we think that's problematic. No, thank you. We also would say that if it actually is true that the duty is to interfere and protect the international community, the best way you can do it is with the most powerful people behind you. So when you isolate countries like the United States and like China by telling them that their vote is just as equal to the vote of, say, Togo, we don't think they're probably going to be very pleased with that, and that intervention that is supposedly the whole point of it is going to work. So because of their first point of responsibility, they never actually explained why that was so and just gave it examples. They never explained to us why invading countries' sovereignty was more important than trying to go for more peaceful measures. We don't think that that point stood. So now because their principled case was rather weak, let's move on into the effectiveness and the practicality, which took up most of the debate. So their first idea, and like most of the examples that they kept referring back to, was that Libya was too late and we should have intervened earlier, and that way we could have saved more lives. It's problematic today that they believe their best solution, and they ran with the thinking that running in without never really knowing all of the facts, just because people might be dying for some reason, is always the best answer, because they think it's always justified. First of all, we don't think that Libya happened at the wrong time, right? We think that it was probably practical and beneficial for the community to sit back and see what happened, because there were forces going on in the state that were hard for us to predict, and it was hard for us to predict what the consequences of our actions might be. What we actually saw was that through intervention, we didn't really see all of the positive effects we want, right? Like, the government that's being established in Libya that we helped prop up isn't really doing the best job. They aren't really on the best human rights record. They haven't established the government they thought we would. There's also a lot of arms still floating around Syria causing problems that we gave them. So we need for them to win the case to justify why military intervention that they back behind so much is the best in every case and never causes harms. Prove it now.
Now, wouldn't you agree that, first of all, with your example of Uzbekistan and Sudan, which really the invasion of Uzbekistan was vetoed by Russia, and that Sudan has already been partitioned, both of these through the Security Council, that the Security Council is actually trying to effectively do all these things, but is being stopped by the power of veto?
That's not the point. The point is that the Security Council can't do effective things when you don't have the backing of powerful countries, and they haven't addressed how countries are going to feel when they have their veto voice taken away. They still need to address that. We hope they get to it in their reply speech. But furthermore, under this idea of intervention, we'd say that, we think that it has to happen, that you need they told us that, you need to have, that compromise is bad, right? And that, because you have this veto, without the veto, you won't have as much compromise because compromise is bad. We actually think that compromise is very good, especially because you're dealing with all of the countries in the world, right? The action that you choose to take should probably be in the best interest of everybody involved. We don't think that they don't think they've shown accurately how that's going to change under their resolution. So now let's move on to their third and final point before I deal up with the model. They told us that dictators harm people because they think they can get away with it. And that's a little problematic because we have a couple problems with it. First of all, how does their resolution change it, right? How does the resolution that maybe you might be able to intervene after the fact faster change the fact that I won't oppress my own people for my own benefit in the first place, right? We think that that actually what happens is they do it because they're despotic, right? And if they really think that that's the reason that they would do it, they should be changing things like the International Criminal Court and the way that we go into countries and arrest dictators. We think that if that's what they're trying to stand for, they should be talking about more preventative measures. They haven't actually tied into their resolution how it fixes the harms they've addressed today, mostly because they failed to adjust the case that we brought to you. So because they've assumed that intervention will always work, which we think is a huge problem, and because they've told us that hasty intervention is always the best way, that there's no room for sober second thought, let's move into how this would actually work. So we had a couple problems with their model. First of all, they told us that we want other voices, so we're going to pass it on majority. What we would say is that how this is going to work is it's going to end up dividing groups, creating teams, and making the Security Council more divisive. So what we would say is that a lot of countries typically think in similar ways. So when there's no power of veto to override that, you're going to end up with teams forming, you're going to end up with countries with similar views forming, and we think that's going to create divisions within the Security Council that aren't going to be productive. Furthermore, we would ask them why countries like Togo deserve the same vote as China and the US. We would ask them why shouldn't global power be reflective by the power of an international body that is supposed to mirror the world? Why, if the United States has more citizens than Togo, if the United States has more international benefit and international prowess than Togo, why the US shouldn't have the capability to make decisions in a more effective manner than Togo? They need to respond to that. Furthermore, we think that it's problematic that France right now has more power than India and Germany, right? Like and that's the problem we came to address to you with our counter model. Finally, they told us that like other voices don't get heard. We would tell you in response that under the Security Council, like all of these minor voices get to have their voice heard. They help draft constitution. They're heard in that way. So under our counter model, their response was that the countries that voted in would be the same. We don't necessarily have a problem with this if countries think that those countries are the most relevant both to the UN and the world. Like we don't think that's necessarily problematic. Secondly, they told us that like Guatemala is in the council and that they shouldn't be voted in. The reason Guatemala is on the council right now is because it's done through regions, right? So Guatemala represents their certain region. Under our model, where you'd have to fit a specific criteria to be nominated to be a part of the P5, they wouldn't only make it if the rest of the global community thought that they were relevant, thought that they contributed enough to the UN to merit it, and thought that they were relevant under the international stage. They told us when we asked you about like the example of Israel that people aren't stupid and won't make hasty decisions. And yet, according to them, decisions aren't hasty enough already, right? Like they would like decisions to be hasty, and they would like them to be hasty to the point of being irrational because they believe that action is the best action. Because we like actually think that gridlock isn't necessarily an issue, that sober second thought can actually be mandatory, that changes to have the power, and that we've shown you that you have an incentive to do things that are right towards the UN to be voted back in because they haven't adjusted and because the veto is actually an indication of where you stand on the world stage, we are proud to oppose.
We now call for the Vice Speaker in opposition.
Today's side proposition hung their hat on this idea that we need to protect people, that the UN needs to intervene and maintain like the rights and the livelihoods of individuals across the world. We think this was a problematic stance for them to take today, seeing as their model actually doesn't create that sort of intervention. We proved to you today because the big powers don't actually, conform to the UN. And secondly, that their model actually creates more conflict, more hasty decisions, harm citizens more. We think that their like basic line of argumentation that we need to protect people never actually adjusted to our argumentation or managed to refute it today, and I'm going to show you why in my two areas of clash, effectiveness and conflict. First, let's look at effectiveness, and we think that we gave you a pretty strong model today, because what our model did was it ensured that we elect the most effective contributing powers to the UN, or to the P5. So it means that like redundant powers that can no longer, are relevant in the world today are taken off, and we get countries coming in who have the most influence, who have the most power, and who can actually fulfill all the goals that we talked about on our case today. We say it takes away redundancy, and it's actually an incentive for these countries to contribute more. We didn't see any sort of response to like why it's to our argumentation that it's beneficial to have more powerful countries there on their side of the house today. They just sort of did some like random scattered attacks on our model that we think were dealt with in our third speech. But what else was talked with under effectiveness? Two types of effectiveness that we talked about today. First of all, we talked about the need for like the P5 or the strongest nations to contribute to the UN, to contribute troops, to contribute their influence, and to contribute like money. We talked about why it's problematic if you disenfranchise these countries like the US and they pull out their support from the UN, like what happened to the League of Nations. The response to that their only real response to that point was that we don't actually need these countries' support because like other countries provide as well. We say, well, that may well be true. The fact that these countries are the most influential ones like China have like a sphere of influence across the globe, and we actually need them to conform to resolutions, makes them a specific case. We think that also our model reaffirms the support of countries like Bangladesh, incentivizes this kind of attitude, tells them that what they're doing is right, and will give them more power on the UN. That wasn't dealt with on their side of the house today. It was in Ali's point. Second of all, in terms of like effectiveness, we talked to you about how resolutions on the Security Council don't work if a country like Russia simply ignores sanctions and continues to trade with Syria. We don't think that that sort of assumption that you need the buy-in of these countries was ever dealt with on their side of the house today. And we think that like you need the big powers to play along. They ignored that refutation. They simply like worked around it. We don't think that their argumentation actually worked. And furthermore, we told you this was harmful, more harmful under our model, because it degrades the legitimacy of the UN if their resolutions are empty and can't be followed through on. We think it's better for them to take more time to negotiate and come out with resolutions that the biggest powers will actually support than what their model actually proposes. So very quickly, let's look at conflict. We think that what came up in the debate today and what they told you is that issues are time sensitive, therefore we need to make hasty, like potentially problematic decisions. We told you that the goal of the UN isn't to create like new conflicts, isn't to go into conflict without like looking them over first. And we think the example of Libya is a great example where eventually some sort of like benefit was provided, but first you needed the biggest powers to buy in. First you needed some sort of negotiation. And we were actually able to have a very effective resolution to a conflict. They brought that up on their side of the house today. It definitely fell on our side of the house. We told you that in fact you create more conflict under their model today. We gave you the examples of the Korean War, what could potentially happen to Israel. Their only response was that countries are rational, that they won't like enter into these decisions because they know the P5 reject to it. We would tell you on our side of the house today that the veto actually acts as an indication that these countries don't agree with this resolution and will go to war for it. That's what we told you on our side of the house today. We think that it actually prevents conflict. That's why it was created. Finally, they brought up this idea of deterrence. We think that actually more deterrence occurs when the resolutions that the UN passes aren't simply empty, when they can actually be followed through with. So when countries like China or Russia or the USA actually follow through with the resolutions and make them effective, we don't think that the deterrence point fell on their side of the house today. So ultimately, because we won both on effectiveness and conflict, we beg to oppose today. Thank you very much.
Ending the debate for today, we call reply speaker in government.
One side of the House today focused on helping civilians. One side of the House today focused on ending injustice. One side of the House today focused on making sure innocent lives are not killed, while the other side of the House focused on appeasing the United Nations and making Russia, China, the etc. very, very happy. And we take complete exception to this. The only people that the United Nations have a responsibility to are the people that are weak, are the people who are dying, are the people that have no defense themselves. And this was the grounds that we came to you on side proposition today. Now, over the course of today's debate, we heard a lot of back and forth and really a lot of clash. So what I'm going to be trying to do through the summary speech is I'm going to be taking a look at what both sides have said and have been saying and trying to paint a much clearer picture of who's really won today's debate. Now, in order to do this, and hopefully in order to make my speech a little bit easier to understand, I've broken today's debate down to three main questions that I believe really encompass the entire debate. So, first of all, would this create better action in the United Nations? Second of all, would this really deter future crimes against humanity? And the third question is, well, is this good for the United Nations as a whole, as an actual organization? So, would this create better action? Side proposition told you that it wouldn't. They said that hasty decisions would be made and without the right to veto, because the United States constantly vetoes Israel. But what we told you is the delegates in the United Nations that get to where they aren't there because they're stupid, and they aren't there because they're hot-headed, and they're not there because they want to commit war. They want to wage war against everyone. We told you that if the people do it, if the delegates do in fact decide to have war, well, they decide to have war because they think it's the right decision, and because they think that yes, they've weighed across the benefits and the consequences of waging war, and they said, well, this is the right course of action. They're simply not going to walk into Israel, take everything down, and be like, World War III. We went beyond this to show you that it really would create better action. We showed you that because we revoke the power of countries like Russia, like China, who really veto against action to save innocent civilians that really have no way to defend themselves. We showed you that the majority as a whole usually votes to stop injustice and usually wants to stop injustice. So by taking away their right to veto, you give the majority the right to actually go in and to stop the injustice they want to stop. So this would in fact create better action. This would not create hasty action because the people are intelligent. This would create immediate action to stop injustice and to stop killing. So the second question today is, well, would this deter future crimes against humanity? Side proposition once again said that it wouldn't. So that because countries like Russia won't be happy, well, they'll get angry and not give their backing to the United Nations. They said that in order to actually take action, in order to really deter future crimes from being held, well, then again, the United Nations need to be legitimate, and in order to be legitimate, we need the backing of really powerful nations. But what we showed you is that, well, for one, the people in the Big Five are powerful nations, and the majority of the Big Five are powerful nations. So on that end, yes, they do have the power to really show their legitimacy and to show that they're actually going to be taking action. Not this one-liner that side proposition gave to us about how, no, we need Russia, and no, they're not going to be happy. But we went beyond this to show you that it really would deter future crimes. We showed that people who do crimes don't do so thinking that they're going to be caught, ladies and gentlemen. They said do so because they think there are no consequences, that they're not going to be caught. We showed you that speeding up the way people make decisions and by taking away the right to veto actively shows them that yes, there is a crime to their right. There is a possibility that they're going to get caught and they're not going to essentially go scot-free. And the international community as a whole recognizes the fact that what they're doing is wrong and they're going to stop what they're doing. And on this end, it does in fact deter future crimes because they see there is a consequence to their actions. So the third question here is, though, would this be good for the UN as an organization as a whole? Well, we really both gave you two models, so let's address both of them. Side proposition told you that, well, we'd vote for other people to get in, so this would be better for the United Nations. What we told you is that they're giving us no real solution to the problem, ladies and gentlemen. We showed you that the same people are going to be voted in regardless. We showed you that countries like China, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom always have the power. So yeah, the fact of the matter is they're going to be voted in back into the United Nations. So they're really not solving anything. But we went beyond this to show that the gridlock in the United Nations right now really needs to be addressed, and the best way to do this is to take away the right to veto and take away the right to countries like Russia, like China, to make sure that no one takes any action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, since you all know this is a very silent round, please cross floor, shake hands. Off you go.
Really amazing debate. Great debate. Good job.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Good job.
That was so great.
Good job.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Guys, obviously you can get feedback after you hear the break announcement. So find us. We're easy to find. We're both very beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In this really hot room, so like extra effort.
I fan myself with all of that.
And it's worse when you get heated while you're debating. I hate it.
I'm just kind of putting everything.
It's going to be a good grand final between the two of us. Thank you once again. Thanks so much again.